Life with Interbeing, Stories of Interbeing. Gina Griffith posted the following story on her blog, and the story is also in the book, Our Wild Calling. She starts. People would ask me, "Is that your dog?" I answered, "Yes, of course," but I felt I was lying. See, Laddie was a border collie, and a more accurate response would have been, "I'm his child." The story begins. Laddie was my best friend, but an inconvenient one too. Once, the popular kids in our town actually invited me, the bookish geek, to join them behind the dentist's office to smoke cigarettes. Hooray! I had finally arrived. The popular kids had invited me to join them. Except I couldn't. Laddie didn't approve. When I turned to cross the street to the dentist's office and that hidden smoking spot, Laddie stood in the way. I walked around him. He stood in my way again. Repeat, except this time he lowered his voice and gave me that border collie stare. This went on for a while, but bit by bit, foot by foot, I was nearing the street. That's when Laddie actually picked up my hand in his mouth, pushed his teeth down to that initial pressure point, all the while giving me that stare. It was clear to me he decided it was better that he bite into my skin than let me go behind the dentist's office. Here, the popular kids began to laugh at me for having a dog that saw himself as my master. So what could I do? I turned and went home, muttering and cursing at Laddie the whole while. Laddie just trotted along in front of me with his "I'm so happy" gait. When we got home, Laddie insisted on actually coming into the house, which he rarely did. My mom was on the phone. Laddie, who was always perfectly behaved when he was in the house, jumped up on the coffee table, so he was at eye level with my mom, who was also seated on the couch and talking on the phone. Laddie stared into my mom's eyes. "I'll call you back," my mom said. "I need to see to something." Mom hung the phone up and said, "Thank you, Laddie. I'll take care of it," to the dog. Then Mom led him outside, turned to me, folded her arms, and said, "Laddie tells me that you need to tell me what you were getting into." Now, of course, I agree with Laddie's choice, and I marvel at how he knew that I should not go back there. Laddie was not my dog. I was the border collie's child, and he raised me right. Now I'm going to say I like that story, and I'm going to suggest that it's an example of deep interspecies communication. In 2017, Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "About 30 years ago, I was looking for an English word to describe our deep interconnection with everything else. I liked the word togetherness, but I finally came up with the word interbeing. Everything relies on everything else in order to manifest." End quote. Biologist Lewis Thomas describes how our human bodies are shared, rented, and occupied by countless other tiny organisms, and without them we couldn't live. He states, "There are no solitary beings. Everything alive thanks the living of everything else." End quote. It is now accepted that our body is a community, and the trillions of non-human cells in our body are even more numerous than the human cells. Without them, we could not be here. Even The mitochondria in our cells that drives metabolism is ancient bacteria that became integrated into our cells. Lewis Thomas realizes that the whole of planet Earth is linked by symbiosis. We're very close to Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, in which the entire planet is viewed as a vast, self-regulating organism. Writer and activist Charles Eisenstein writes that our civilization is based on an old story, the story of separation. He believes this story has led to intense suffering, alienation, environmental degradation, and poverty. He writes, "The new story of the people is a story of interbeing, of reunion. In its personal expression, it proclaims our deep interdependency on other beings, not only for the sake of surviving, but also even to exist. It knows that my being is part of your being. In its collective expression, the new story says the same thing about humanity's role on Earth and relationship to the rest of nature. In this story that unites us across so many, it is this story that unites us across so many areas of activism and healing. The more we act from it, the better we are able to create a world that reflects it. The more we act from separation, the more we helplessly create more of that too." End quote. He states that he just began using the term interbeing without really knowing why or where it came from. Then he was informed that the word was coined by Thich Nhat Hanh, so he gave the word back to him. But he felt that the word was in the atmosphere because it's just so true, and the time for that truth to be revealed to mass society had arrived. He writes, "It's like in those French bakeries where they don't need to add yeast to the dough because the yeast is so ambient in the air and the dough gets quickened whether or not you add yeast to it. Many people, even without doing a whole lot of studying and reading, are coming to the same kinds of conclusions and perceptions about the world as I am." End quote. In Richard Louv's book, Our Wild Calling, he describes the emerging science of critical anthropomorphism, the practicality for biologists to use their mind to imagine what it's like to be the animal they are observing. It began with Jane Goodall, who was just doing what made sense and defying patriarchy in the process. She realized that using empathy helps us to know what to look for when studying an animal. Each animal has its own ways of intelligently interacting with its world. In modern biology, critical anthropomorphism is gaining popularity. It requires that the biologist use their imagination along with knowledge of the species being studied to generate a testable hypothesis. In other words, like Jane Goodall, the researcher uses their knowledge and connection to imagine what it's like to be a certain animal, and then how that animal might behave. That imaginal connection informs their observation. Oliver Sacks wrote, "Clearly, nature calls to something very deep in us. Biophilia, the love of nature and living things, is an essential part of the human condition. Hortophilia, the desire to interact with, manage, and tend nature, is also deeply instilled in us. The effects of nature's qualities on health are not only spiritual and emotional, but physical and neurological." End quote. I believe that more of us need to use empathy, imagination, and a felt sense of interbeing to guide our interactions with the world. Alongside empathy and imagination is insight. Are we aware of how each of the many choices we make every day, some out of habit, affect the web of life? As Chief Seattle was quoted as saying, "Man did not weave the web of life, he is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself." Time for some levity. First joke. An HDMI cable and an electrical outlet went on a date. It didn't go well because they couldn't connect. One more. There are three guys who are stranded on a South Pacific island. One day, the three of them chance upon an old style Arabian lamp. On impulse, one of them picks it up and rubs the side, and out pops a genie. The genie says, "I will grant each of you a wish." The first guy says, "I'd like to be back with my family and community." And whoosh, he's gone. The second guy says, "I was a monk. I would like to be back at the monastery." And whoosh, he's gone. The third guy says, "I miss those two guys and I want them back." Whoosh. Deep connection, by its nature, will not act selfishly. Consider this quote from Jesus: "What you do to the least of us, you do unto me." He's talking about deep connection. He's saying, if we knew that harm done to those without privilege also harmed me, harms everyone, might we reconsider? Jesus spread a teaching of true love. Now, I'd like to develop a thought experiment. Consider the biblical commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." There'd be no need for the commandment if people weren't killing each other, committing acts of murder. This is an attempt to structure civilization and create rules that may sustain harmony. As it happens, it conveniently excludes all the variations on war that make killing and enslaving others all right. "Thou shalt not kill" becomes a tribal law, and we may ignore the violence done to outsiders. In some ways, the Ten Commandments are a worthy entry into group living, sort of rules for teenagers who may really need to be told what's not all right. With the reality of globalization, we need to do better. If we slowly and surely train ourselves, becoming ever closer to the potential of true love, cultivating and living in the field of love, no such rule would be necessary. It would never occur to us to kill or treat minorities with cruelty if we integrated a perception of universal love. It would never even occur to us to cause separation or harm. Now, I am speaking from ideals. It's worthwhile to cultivate ideals, blend our ideals with the reality of our challenges and perceptions. To go biblical again, compare the Ten Commandments to the Beatitudes spoken by Jesus. "Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the peacemakers." These are religious suggestions for the maturing heart. If you embrace universal love, you can only act from the field of love. True love as an aspect of being is now gathering aspect in our modern world. But to live from love is not always easy. Our economy is set up for profit, not universal harmony. We are trained from an early age that we need to compete to get ahead. We're sometimes taught selfish love, love that is conditional on getting what we want. Civilization needs good rules and regulations for the foreseeable future, but we can unlearn negative conditioning. I'm suggesting that we can move incrementally in the direction of interbeing. We can progress one loving act at a time. We can resonate with the field of interbeing as we amplify our undivided love in synergistic accord. Here's a start. Loving someone we see as neutral with the same source of love that we easily find for those we hold most dear. At this point, love can begin to teach. Our love can grow. We love a pet, then we love a garden, then we love a forest, then we love groups of people with all their complexities and begin to learn patience and generosity. As our love grows, we may contribute more harmony than conflict, participate more in the story of interbeing than in the story of separation. As I see it, there are at least 3 ways to experience interbeing. The first is through empathy, insight through a felt sense of connection. The second is through clarity, insight through discernment, and understanding how connection in wholeness is just more practical than separation and polarity. The third is through loving without the need for any other words or descriptions. A felt sense of interbeing can lead to co-resonance, acting in consort with with a shared sense of unity. We can act in harmony through empathy, clarity, or love. Whether we act through any of those pathways, it now seems imperative. We may need to reach a tipping point of awake people who can act instinctively to make necessary changes, changes that reduce the collective pain our species may experience in the future because of global warming. Co-resonance, or acting through interbeing, will inform the choices we make ongoing, day to day. We will feel or think that it is in our interest to treat the earth as an organic whole. So let's pause for a moment of brief reflection. I'm going to suggest that we silently review aspects of this talk that may have spoken to you or you feel may need clarification. Or perhaps you'd like to marinate with something that resonated with you. Or you can begin an inquiry into how you might live in the story of interbeing. You may close your eyes if you'd like, or not, and consider these suggestions as I review them. I'll ring the bell. Review aspects of this talk that spoke to you or you feel need clarification or review. Marinate with whatever resonates with you. Let it sink in a little. You might ask yourself if there are ways to live more fully in togetherness with all life, how you might live through interbeing. You can open your eyes if you'd like. I'd like to end with a poem by Gary Lawless. When the animals come to us asking for help, will we know what they are saying? When the plants speak to us in their delicate, beautiful language, will we be able to answer them? When the planet herself sings to us in our dreams, will we be able to wake ourselves and act? Thank you for sharing these moments together.